can't speak, but sometimes their silence screams louder than the living. And in the case of Jeffrey Epstein, that silence became a language of power, one written not in words, but in missing pages, redacted names, and sealed files that refused to rest. Tonight, we follow the shadows that never went away. When the news broke years ago that Jeffrey Epstein was found dead in his Manhattan jail cell, the world exhaled not in relief, but in disbelief. His story was one of money, influence, and manipulation so tightly woven, it seemed unreal. And yet, as the years passed, those threads began to twitch again. Documents resurfaced. Files once locked away in the vaults of the powerful began to whisper. But here's the twist. Those whispers aren't telling a story of a man. They're telling a story of a system, and that system, some say, is still very much alive. In November 2025, a new wave hit. Hidden emails, congressional petitions, and unseen correspondence spilled into public view. Headlines read like "Deja vu, Epstein's files resurface," new names hinted, emails reveal powerful connections. But in the age of noise, it's not always the words that matter, it's the silence between them. We live in a world addicted to truth, yet allergic to proof. The Epstein files, they've become more myth than material, a shape-shifting archive that both exists and doesn't. Every time we think we've reached the bottom, another layer of shadow appears. But let's rewind. Jeffrey Epstein was more than a financier. He was an enigma, a man who built trust in rooms where trust was currency. He moved like a phantom between billionaires and politicians, scientists and royalty. People called him a genius investor. Few asked what he was really investing in. His wealth was strange, built on promises and access. His world, stranger still, a revolving door of influence, power, and secrecy. But here's the eerie part. For decades, he thrived in plain sight. Complaints surfaced, allegations brewed, yet every attempt to expose him somehow collapsed. Cases vanished, settlements buried, witnesses silenced by fear or fatigue. It was as if something larger, invisible, protected him. Then 2019 came. The walls closed in. His arrest was supposed to be the beginning of an ending, but the ending came first: an early morning, a cell, and a death that raised more questions than it answered. The cameras didn't work that night. The guards fell asleep. And just like that, the man at the center of a global scandal became another ghost in the system. For a while, the world raged. Hashtags, investigations, documentaries. And then, silence again. The files sealed, the networks untouchable, the questions unanswered. But shadows have a way of returning. And so, when Congress recently pushed to unseal the Epstein files, it wasn't just reopening an investigation, it was reopening a wound. Inside those files are emails, names, timelines, but most of all, traces of how influence flows, how secrets are kept, and how justice sometimes forgets the powerful. Yet here's where the story bends again. Even as these new documents surface, no one can say what's real and what's reconstruction. The files are a mirror reflecting what we want to believe, not necessarily what's true. It is like chasing shadows on a wall. Every time we think we read touching substance, the light shifts. Still, some details chill the air. Among the newly unsealed communications, references appear to high-ranking figures, coded meetings, unexplained transactions. Nothing conclusive, but enough to reignite the question: how deep does this go? There are those who claim the files are merely fragments, a distraction from something far darker. Others argue that they're the tip of an iceberg, one that touches politics, academia, even global governance. But no one agrees on which version is true. Maybe all of them are, or none, because here's the paradox of the Epstein case. The closer you get to it, the less solid it becomes. Like mist, it slips through your fingers. Every institution that touched Epstein, from law enforcement to philanthropy, left fingerprints it can't erase. Grants to research labs, donations to elite schools, parties and foundations intertwined in webs of goodwill and guilt. And in each web, the same pattern repeats: silence at the top, whispers at the edges. But silence isn't absence, it's strategy. As the new Epstein files stir public debate, the question isn't only about what is in them, it's about what is missing. Why were certain names redacted? Why do timestamps not align? Why do some emails reference meetings that never appear on official records? It's as if the files were built not just to document, but to misdirect, to create a version of truth that hides the real one behind it. Some insiders call it the shadow list, not a list of names, but it favors a network of influence trading built over years, protected by the illusion of legitimacy. And if that's true, then maybe the real Epstein story isn't about a person. Maybe it's about the machinery of power itself, the silent agreement between wealth and immunity. It's a machinery that outlived him. Because when one man dies, systems don't collapse. They adapt, the same circles still thrive, new names, new foundations, new promises of reform, the same mechanisms of control, private jets, secret donors, quiet settlements. Different players, same game. And perhaps that is the greatest shadow of all, that the Epstein files are only a reflection of a world that never stopped doing what it always did, only smarter, quieter, deeper. But let's imagine for a moment that these files could talk. What would they say? Would they reveal names, or would they whisper about institutions too big to fail? Would they tell us who enabled the crimes, or who benefited from their silence? Maybe both, maybe neither, because shadows don't confess. They distort. When the new emails emerged, one even suggesting that he knew about the girls, referring to a figure of power, the world erupted again. But the pattern repeated: outrage, denial, noise, and then fading interest. Because scandals involving power are like waves. They crash hard, but they always recede. What remains is the undertow, the silent pull beneath the surface that drags questions down where light doesn't reach. Somewhere in those unredacted lines, there are clues not just to crimes, but to culture, how we elevate monsters because they dine with the elite, how money forgives what morality won't. But even as we dig, we might be digging into the wrong thing. Because what if the Epstein files are not the real secret? What if they were just a decoy, a controlled burn to satisfy curiosity, while the real archives, the real transactions, the real alliances remain sealed elsewhere? Think about it. Every major scandal leaves behind two trails, the visible one for the public and the invisible one for those who matter. Maybe we're only seeing the shadow of the real crime, and maybe that's the design. At True Shadows Real, we've seen this pattern before, the illusion of disclosure, where transparency is a mask. The files surface, names circulate, outrage spikes, but the structure remains untouched. It's not about revealing truth, it's about controlling it. A shadow government doesn't need to hide, it only needs to distract. And if Epstein's empire was ever truly dismantled, why do so many of his associates still move freely through corridors of power? Why are donations rebranded, companies renamed, and silence still rewarded with comfort? Because maybe this isn't a story that ended with his death. Maybe it's one that never ends at all. They say documents don't lie, but what if these documents were written by the lie itself? A trap for curiosity, a labyrinth for the mind. Every redaction, a door. Every missing page, a question. And every question, a mirror. The more we stare into it, the more we see ourselves, our fascination with darkness, our complicity and attention, our hunger for scandal. Epstein's files are as much about us as they are about him. We built the audience. We kept the story alive. Because somewhere deep down, we fear that if the shadows fade, the light might reveal something worse, the system that made him possible, still humming quietly beneath our world. So, what's really inside the Epstein files? Maybe not names, but patterns. Not evidence, but echoes. Not closure, but clues to a larger silence. A silence that protects not just individuals, but the entire architecture of influence. Maybe the Epstein files are not the end of a scandal. Maybe they're the beginning of a revelation we're not ready for. Because shadows don't die, they just change shape. And as long as power hides in plain sight, those files, whether redacted, released, or rewritten will remain exactly what they are, a mirror of the world that created them, a reflection of secrets that can never fully be told, a ghost story written in the language of wealth. And so, we end where we began. The dead can't speak, but sometimes, their silence screams. And if you listen closely enough, you'll hear that the echoes of Jeffrey Epstein are not echoes at all. They're footsteps, footsteps of a system still walking among us, still writing its files, still casting its shadows. The question is, will we ever step out of them?